Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development CropTalk webinar. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please type them into the question section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Felice. I'd like to welcome everybody to the October 20th edition of Crop Talk. And today, what we're going to do is we're getting close to the end of the season, and I thought it'd be good to have our crop scouting panel just go through and answer some of the questions that were maybe carried over from last week, as well as look at some of the questions that have come in over the past week here as well. So I guess just before we get going, a look at where we are. I guess harvest in most areas is complete. There's still the odd field of corn and sunflowers out there, but I think in general most areas are complete right now. The rainfall we got was definitely welcome. It sure made a change for fertilizer application, and there's been a big swing on fertilizer application in the last week to 10 days here. The fields are getting done and wrapped up fairly quickly, and but with that, there also came in quite a few questions as some producers are maybe looking at changing the way they do things a little bit, or just looking at new things on the farm. I think a lot of guys have had some extra time on their hands right now, and what they're doing is looking at things and asking questions to see if they'll work. So some of those questions have come in, so hopefully we can help answering some of those questions today as we go through the webinar. So with that, we might as well get going at on some of the questions. So one of the questions that has come in is some producers that were normally, I guess, seeding putting all their fertilizer on in the spring in a one-pass situation are looking at putting fertilizer on this fall. And this question came in from, I call it pothole country, but anywhere kind of north of #1 highway. A lot of the areas have potholes, and the question came in as, if I'm putting the fertilizer on this fall, and if there's water in those some of the low spots next spring, what's going to happen to that fertilizer? How long do I have before I start losing it? So maybe John, we'll pass that one over to you to start off today.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question, and one that we kind of have some research for, that I'm going to suggest that this grower, and I think you had another question, something about variable rate. And I'm going to say, well, it depends on what form of fertilizer he puts in those low spots. First of all, those are at-risk areas. So if fertilizer he puts on, or she puts on, converts from the ammonium or urea form to nitrate, it's ready to go. Probably not leaching, but when you have standing water, that's when we lose nitrogen as N2 gas or nitrous oxide gas, which nobody really wants. So, and we know we've got some Manitoba data that gives, I'm sure this person's asking for a rate. He will lose, or she will lose, nitrogen at the rate of 2 to 4 pounds of nitrogen per acre per day when water is sitting on that field and the soil temperature water is about 5 degrees C. So the warmer the soil is when the water is sitting there, the more rapid the rate of loss. So the losses are potentially real. And so what's the farmer strategy? Well, it's to keep the nitrogen not in the nitrate form, but in the ammonium form as long as possible. Ammonium form, it's held on the clay and organic matter particles. It's not in a form that can be lost. So first way he can do that is not put the nitrogen in the wet spots, just withhold it and put it on in the spring. I think he's asking to put it on now. So it's, well, then your strategy is put it on when soils are cool, band apply it, and use a protected form, either as a ESN that's physically protected or one with a nitrification inhibitor that keeps it stabilized in that ammonium form longer. And I'd be so bold as to suggest right now is that this is an example of where variable source application is good in the landscape. If I had the option of putting on ammonia and I had a toggle switch with my N-serve, I would socket to it in the wet spots, and I would say, you know, I may not get high losses in the well-drained areas, so I just turn my N-serve off. Perfect example of where variable source, variable way to apply protected nitrogen where it's needed at high risk, and where to back off where it's at low risk of loss. Marla, anything to add to that?
Nope, you're good, John.
Okay, so the second part of the question that he asked me as well is if he does coat the fertilizer, will it, compared to the high ground, the wet areas, the coating lasts the same, wetness doesn't affect the coating, or that was the question?
Oh, well, you better tell me what flavor is going on then. What flavor of coating?
Okay.
Magazine, it's not doing much against stabilization. That's just preventing volatilization. But let's not even go to a coating unless I know that it's banded in the soil. If it's broadcast, I would just say, well, I'll show you again, but I just consider that kind of a dumb way of putting on fertilizer in the fall.
This is going to be banded, and yeah, and he was just wondering if the coating, how long it'll last. And he never did mention to me what type of coating he was using. But
yeah. Well, I won't give an answer unless I know the coating. But anyways, yes, no, we expect that what the coating will do, if it's a nitrification inhibitor, it will prevent or slow down the bugs from converting his urea to nitrate this fall. And the coating, whether, I don't care whether it's lasting next year or not, it's held, and that nitrogen is overwintering as ammonium, not as nitrate. And if it's overwintering as ammonium, even in saturated soil conditions, ammonium is not going to be lost. So the trick is to keep the bugs from working this fall, and cool soils, banding is one approach, but the three-prong to that is using that nitrification inhibitor. Make sure he's using a source with a proven mode of action. We know that the products like Super U that has DCD in it is a proven inhibitor. We know that on ammonia, it's N-serve or Centuro or Entrench on urea. I think there's a bunch of pretenders out there in the marketplace, and tell them to put the onus on his agronomist to sell him a product that is proven performance.
okay, so the big trick too, I guess, is now that we're getting some cooler temperatures, I think we'll be ahead of the game too, right? That's
except in the wet spots, except in the really wet spots. Yep.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, that's the first question handled. Thanks, John. Marla, you were on there, and I got this question from a guy when he was out doing some high-ho work on his field, and he was wondering about digging a ditch along some of his saline areas. And by digging the ditch, he was talking basically 4 wide and 4 deep, and wondering if that would help reduce his saline areas. Any opinion there?
I guess it depends on where the water is moving in a ditch like this. So anything that's moving surface water isn't really going to do anything if you've got runoff into that ditch, because all you're doing is kind of increasing that overland flow of water and not increasing the interior flow of water through the soil profile or lowering the water table. So when you think about like the idea of digging a ditch like this, or the alternative, if you were doing proper subsurface drainage, so putting in a tile or something, the purpose of a tile is to lower the water table. And if you have a high water table that has salinity in it, and you can appropriately lower that water table with the installation of tile, then you may be able to leach some of that water or out some of that salt out through that soil profile, because you're lowering the water table. Digging a ditch like this may or may not actually be lowering the water table across the field. That's the whole point, is that you want to actually lower the water table in the areas next to the ditch, as opposed to just kind of opening it up and allowing for overland flow and maybe some kind of subsurface seep out of the soil. But it might not be the most effective way to do a lot. The other issue, of course, if you're looking at doing some kind of trenching and such, because I mean, we work for the government, so we have to remind people of this, is that you do require drainage permits for this type of work. And so if you are digging a deep trench, it might be outside of what is kind of a general registration for drainage. And so that's something to keep in mind and be on the lookout for. But again, if you have low-lying areas like this, the question really becomes whether or not you can actually get that water table lowering and then getting that effective seepage or leaching of the salts from the surface down deeper into the profile. And digging a ditch like this may not be sufficient in order to do that type of thing, to really get the salt leaching. And you're trying to get downward movement of water through the profile, as opposed to just trying to drain water out of the field.
Okay, so after that drainage ditch dries out, because it's deeper, his theory was the water was going to come to that ditch from subsoil, probably not from a very far distance, though, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It's not, it's, you know, think of this as being the idea of laying one single drain tile. If you're going to kind of compare it to something. And so that one single tile is not actually going to be moving water from a very far distance because of just the way that hydrologic effect for how the water is draining under the surface. So yeah, the idea is to try to drain that water out. The other caution in something like this is the water will only run to that area if there is groundwater or water to kind of leach through. So if you dig a ditch like this that's 4 feet deep and it's not filling in a year like this year, where our water table might not be that high, and say we have a couple more dry years and it doesn't fill and water doesn't seep in, because again, the water table is below the depth of this ditch, you're not going to have any decrease of your salinity problem, because there's no moisture or rainfall that's actually washing the salt through the profile into that water table that then flows into a ditch or tile. Same thing with tiling. So in any of these cases, when we're thinking about manipulating water flow underground in order to move those salts down and then out of the soil through a tile or through a ditch, you have to have water to leach it out. So you can go ahead and cut something like this or put a drain tile in, but unless we have higher rates of precipitation to wash salts down, we won't actually see any effect from the installation of these types of things. So again, we need precipitation to help move salts down. And that's why we see those kind of high and low levels of salinity in these areas, where it kind of ebbs and flows through the wet and dry cycles. Right now we're in a dry cycle, we see a lot of salinity at the surface. And then it'll start to kind of go away to some degree once we end up having a bit of moisture to move those salts back down a little deeper into the profile.
Okay, I guess one question I just wanted to add more for, I guess, his information. So a tile, if you put a tile in the ground, like how wide of an area would it affect? Like how many feet on either side, or does it depend on the soil?
It's going to depend on the soil. So if you're dealing with a sandier soil, like areas around Carmen and such, where we're on sands that overlie, like the wet sands that overlie clay, we see tile spacings a bit wider because water can move through that sand more freely because it has larger pore spaces. Whereas if you're dealing with a clay loam or a clay soil, you have to space your tile tightly or more tightly together in order to actually see that water flow. And remember, if you are thinking about something like tile is, the purpose of tile is to lower the water table to the depth of the tile. So if you don't have a high water table, your tile doesn't really do a whole lot for you. But where you have a high water table, then the tile is designed to get that movement of water through the soil where the water table is sitting, and then draining towards the tile and out through the tile. And so if you're dealing with heavier clays or clay loam or heavier clay soils, the spacing is going to depend greatly on that texture and will have to be tighter together if you're dealing with the heavier clay content. The pore spacing in your soil is naturally smaller because of clay content. If you think about how long it takes when water is ponded on a soil surface and how long it takes to soak in, that can give you a bit of an indication then of how long it takes underground then too, or how quickly it can drain underground towards that tile. So where you have kind of poor water movement, it's going to take a lot longer for the tile to kind of access that water and move it out.
Okay, good. Thanks, Marla. Question just came in, and John, I'm going to ask you this one here. In regards to sunflower fertility, any general rule of thumb in terms of adding or not adding sulfur to the fertilizer program? Are sunnies sensitive to sulfur deficiency?
Not that I'm aware of. It's been a long time since there's been any sunflower fertility work done, so we would just basically stick with the recommendation on the books. Now, unlike other crops generally benefit because they also have canola in the rotation, and if farmers fertilize canola generously with sulfur, the other crops, the cereals and the pulses, generally coast along for the ride. But if you're a sunflower grower, you're probably not having canola in the rotation because you don't want the sclerotinia baggage that comes with it. So being in a sunflower rotation may mean that your soils have been lacking historic sulfur applications. So maybe it is prudent. We see this occurring in corn and cereals, eastern Manitoba, when people drop canola out of the rotation, that in a couple cycles, all of a sudden we're running shy on sulfur when we don't grow canola. So that would be the pointer I'd have, is that it's still good to put canola or sulfur somewhere in the rotation, but I can't say whether sunflowers are a heavy feeder or not.
Okay, good. Thanks, John. Been getting some questions, or actually quite a few questions this fall, about falling numbers and how it's becoming more of a grading factor on a lot of the grain that's being hauled to the elevators. And so some of the questions are coming in, is there something we can do to help control this number? And some of the guys are asking about fertilizer, variety, fungicide application. And so Anne is away today, and Rajan has been good enough to come on today. So Rajan, I'm gonna pass this question on to you.
Yes, good morning, and yes, thank you for the question and having me this morning. Yeah, the falling number, I guess a little bit of background about that. Yeah, it is an indicator, I guess, that's used for grading wheat. And typically, yeah, the falling number is, again, this is used at the Grains Commission here. I've got some information I pulled off their website. It says that the falling number test is used to evaluate the amount of sprout damage in Canadian wheats. Now, you would think there wouldn't have been too much sprout damage this summer because we've had relatively dry conditions, but at harvest, I know from the escarpment where I am to the west, there was significant rainfall during harvest while there was still some wheat either standing or in the swath, and that's where some of the sprouting can happen. And so this is basically an enzyme when exposed to moisture and cooling temperatures, can be initiated and starts to break down the starch in the wheat, and so and that eventually leads to germination. So that's not desirable, obviously. So the falling number is a time. It's measured in seconds for a stir or some ground wheat that's been dissolved in waters to measure how fast this a bit of a plunger falls through. And so and it's an indication. So the faster it's falling through that solution, basically it means that there's been more breakdown, a more advanced state of germination of that starch. It's a little bit like dissolving white sugar in water would not really change too much the viscosity of that liquid, but if you add starch, which is a more complex sugar, and you mix that in, it would add to the viscosity and would slow down something falling through that. So that's a little bit of what it's doing. It's measuring that time that this plunger falls through there. And so for the highest grade of wheat, red spring wheat here, normally the falling number is greater than 350 seconds. Again, that's measured in seconds. So a little bit more information. So yeah, so what triggers that? Again, it happens while the grain is still on the plant. So it can be either standing in the field or in a swath. And so once it gets cool weather, again, especially with the rain, increases the likelihood of pre-harvest sprouting. I know a farmer by Belmont was telling me some of his wheat was still standing this fall or late August, whenever in August, and it had received some like 4.5 inches of rain. So that would be over a number of days. So that would be condition where you could, see that this could be triggered. So yeah, so that's the condition there. Yeah, so what can be done to prevent that? Again, the first thing here, harvesting wheat quickly after maturity would be desirable, because yeah, the sooner that once it reaches maturity, the quicker it is harvested, and the rain damage potentially is eliminated. So I think most people do that anyway, as long as depending on the maturity within the field itself, there can be some variability, but you want to wait till your grain is mature and harvest as quickly as possible. Another factor is some plant wheat cultivars have more genetic resistance to pre-harvest sprouting. And so that's, for instance, AAC Brandon, which is a dominant wheat spring variety that we have, is rated as poor, actually, against sprouting, compared to something like AAC Viewfield is rated as good. Same with AAC Redberry, and AAC Starbuck is rated as fair. So that's another factor that can be used to prevent again, sprouting in the field at harvest time, and when the conditions are favorable for that. And lastly, to store, whenever you do harvest grain that may be sprouted, to store separately, because it's if it's not too badly sprouted, if the falling number is say around the 220 to 300 seconds, once it's put into storage, apparently this enzyme that causes the breakdown of the starch is degraded over time. So you might be able to gain some time on that falling number, and potentially a grade as well. But you don't want to mix the two, like a lower grade, something that's been more affected by sprouting versus something that's not, because it's not going to improve your falling number. You're more likely to bring it down than to increase it. So those would be the main factors, again, causing the falling number to drop, and also how to prevent it. Now, I'm not sure about fertility or fungicides, if that makes much of a difference there. It's really more variety specific and weather condition specific at harvest time.
Okay.
I'd like to mention, I think there's some people suggesting that sulfur has a role, and sulfur has a role in wheat protein, in that sulfur bonds are important between certain amino acids, and that helps give gluten strength and will help with loaf volume. But that's different than falling number. Falling number, as Réjean has said, is the germination process gone awry when you don't want it to. And so Sulfur can affect protein, but it's different than this process. And this gluten strength, no one's rewarding farmers for higher sulfur in wheat. So it hasn't been a highly recommended practice. We don't see, maybe someday it will be rewarded, but farmers really right now aren't rewarded for pumping up the sulfur level in wheat.
Okay, good. Thanks, guys. Another second part to the question was artificial drying or aerating. Sometimes they say if you dry your grain, you can affect the germination. Any comments on that? Would that affect the, kind of sprung that on you guys? I'm not sure if we'll have the answer, but have you guys heard anything about that?
If I can take a stab at it, I would say, yeah, the temperature limiting is big. Well, when you put grain in storage, or if you expose it to heat, it's still a living organism. That germ is still living and breathing at a very slow, reduced rate, but still is. So when you expose, and so it can tolerate, temperature rise to some extent, but once you get beyond a certain point, then you can probably cause some damage to that germ. And so that would not be something that would be desirable, obviously, especially if you're looking to use that seed as a seed for the fall for another year. But in terms of drying, just to keep in storage and to sell, maybe not so much of an effect there. It might, again, you don't want to go too high because it might have some other physical properties to the starch, maybe with the protein to caramelize some of it, but. Yeah, it's a balance. It's balancing act, and I think it's around 60 Celsius is usually the maximum recommended, 45 to 60, depending on the grain as to how high you can go in temperature.
Yeah, I just note that in more humid environments where sprouting in August is more common, like in Ontario, growers usually start combining if they're in this weather at 18% moisture and just dry it down to safe moisture in order to avoid sprouting and avoid falling number issues. So if this is a real problem for growers, they could just look at advancing harvest and taking the last few points of moisture out with a dryer or a fan and a bit of air in August and a bit of heat in August.
Great. Good. Thanks, guys. I guess another question for Marla and John. See a lot of this happening over the past couple weeks. We're getting more and more breaking of pasture land and hayland, and one producer was asking me what the best way, he bought a half section of pasture and he wants to crop it next year, and he was wanting to know the best way of getting that into crop production. And so he was asking if he needed to deep till, plow, or just rotor or pro till it. So what are your guys' opinions on trying to get sod bound land into production?
Well, I guess it's going to depend on a lot of different things, like what seeding capabilities you have and whether or not you have the ability to direct seed in. And that, again, is going to depend a lot on a few different factors. If ripping and disking is the way that you do things, and that's the best way to prepare the seed bed for what you need to plant into, then so be it. We recognize, though, that being the dry conditions that we're in right now, any working of the field is probably drying down that field a little bit more. Although if we're dealing with pasture land in this case, or hayland that is being ripped up, it may be quite dry regardless, or like more dry than a normal annual crop field, just because there would have been more moisture uptake depending on the crop growth and the length of the season that pasture was growing. One word of caution, though, and I know that this is always a tricky one, because when crop prices look good and everybody wants to convert pasture land into annual cropland for productivity and economic reasons. Think about why that land was put into pasture or hay in the first place. And so if this is land that is not highly productive for annual cropping reasons, or quite often these lands have been put into perennials because of the fact that they're saline or have some kind of other issue that affects crop production. If it's a salinity issue, it's going to come back and bite you in the future again, because we're managing that salinity with that long-term forage water uptake that's happening. And so recognize that some land will have to go back into pasture or hay again, because it's really not meant for annual crop production. But in those cases, looking at the history of the land, why that land may have been put into hay in the first place, and whether or not some of the soils information available indicates that you're always going to have that natural salinity problem, then keep that in mind too. So I know that goes off topic, but I always have to remind people of that, because quite often people forget and then they end up having a salinity problem that comes back up again. And it had been managed just nicely with that pasture.
Oh, you're just such a Debbie Downer, Marla. Anyways, I can't let you be alone there. Yeah, some of these run-out pastures and hayland probably pretty low in soil nutrients. So my reminder, if you're going to do any tillage, make sure you've spread all your stockpiled beef manure out there first, because it's probably going to need it. And if you're going to be incorporating anyways, you may as well be working manure in the ground at the same time.
Good point, John. And I did bring up the salinity issue because I agree with you 100%, Marla, that a lot of the land that's being broken up now, in a few years' time, we're going to see some big white spots out in some of those fields, and guys having to look at seeding it back down again. So.
Exactly, and we've seen this before, and it goes through the cycles with crop prices. As they increase, we see more land being broken, and then some frustrations later on when those salinity problems keep coming back. So we're just as long as people recognize that the forage is managing the salinity, it doesn't get rid of the salinity, it's managing it for you. And so that long-term management comes from continuing with the same practice. And so everybody needs to keep that in mind. And if you have questions on whether or not soil is appropriate for this, AgriMaps can be a helpful tool in to some degree, and people can always contact me if they want to talk about further too.
Great. Thanks, Marla. Okay, John, fertilizer prices are going up, and this producer asked me if he should be putting fertilizer on his hayland this fall or waiting to spring. Looking at putting on phosphate and potash, and then he asked if he needs to coat it, if he's going to be spreading it on his forage land.
Okay, well, yes, it's prudent to fertilize your hay and pasture land if you're looking to get productivity out of it. I see that it is just it's a base investment in getting yield in order to build in predominantly your phosphate and potash, but also sulfur in some cases. And whether I can't project whether prices will go up in the spring or not, but as far as fall application, we actually like early fall application, so the plant has some opportunity to work. So hopefully there's some rain to incorporate some of that surface fertilizer, take it in the root zone. We actually like to have potassium taken up by the plant. I don't want it sitting on the surface. When it's in the plant, it acts kind of as antifreeze and will keep particularly legumes, help with winter survival. So the earlier you can get it on, a good time is after first cut. But anyways, if it's at this point now and you can still access fertilizer and a spreader, can be a good time. As far as I know, there's no coating that is warranted on phosphate and potash. The only coating I would see is if someone was wanting to get a head start on fertilizing pastures with nitrogen and maybe considering a coated urea, which we call ESN, but that would, I think, really be the only instance for that. And yeah, but yeah, if you're going to be harvesting, if we really need hay production off, We need to be replenishing what's removed, and we need about 15 pounds of phosphate per ton, and I think between 40 and 60 pounds of potassium per ton that we're removing. So those are kind of maintenance amounts to replace what you're removing.
Okay, well, I've got you speaking, John. A couple of questions have just come in. One is, I'm guessing it's somebody that has an anhydrous for a while. He says, I have an older NH3 applicator and noticing changes in flow rates during the day. Is there a way I can manage the flow rate?
Well, I'll confess right up front, yeah, I'm sure there probably is, and I'm not the person to advise on that. I would talk really closely to the dealer that's servicing it. They'll have far more experience with dealing with mechanical issues than I will.
Yeah, so it would probably have as it warms up during the day, it would flow faster probably.
Yeah, I'm not going to step outside of my expertise here.
Okay, no problem. And the second part to that question is sometimes you'll see a cloud of gas behind the applicator. Is he losing a lot of product, or is this more condensation of the cool product?
Yes, it is generally the condensation, and the amounts we've tried to measure it unsuccessfully, but when they do try to measure, there's generally very slight losses. If there were to be losses, it's generally because not a lack of moisture in the soil, but because it's too cloddy and we're unable to get good tilth of the soil to provide slot closure. If we're seeing that, we suggest applying deeper, or sure people don't want to do this, but do some pre-tillage so that the soil is broken down more and will flow around and seal those trenches. But I think we've had enough moisture in general now that ammonia application is going to go down fairly well. And so I see some of that emissions coming out there. That's normal. If your dog can't follow you around, if the dog is knocked out, well, then you probably got too much. And I would say go deeper.
Okay, good comment, John. Dane, you had a comment regarding the applicators, if you want to chime in there. Talise, could you unmute Dane, please?
Sorry, I'm just trying to locate him on the list here.
What we'll do is I'll go to the next question. We'll come back to Dane's comment once we get him on here. So
I think I got him now. Dane, can you hear us?
Hi, everyone. Yes, Lionel, you had a question or comment about pressure regulation on the anhydrous tanks. It's one of the basic laws of chemistry that as temperatures heat up and warm up during the day, pressure increases due to increased vapor pressure in the anhydrous tank. So you will see increased flow just due to artificially boosting the pressure out of the tanks. Both old and new regulators do this, but newer regulators and more advanced equipment that's a little bit tighter and less leaks, that sort of thing, can manage it. But like John said, yeah, talk to your detailer, your dealer, or the anhydrous equipment supplier, and perhaps see what adjustments could be made.
Okay, good. Thanks, Dane. Next question. Seems like we're hearing about shortages of a lot of different things right now, and one of the comments the producer made to me was he's looking at buying some of his chemical this fall to either make sure he has it in the spring or to avoid more price increases. So he was starting to be concerned about winter storage, as he in the past hasn't had to store a lot of the chemical on the farm, but he's looking at having to do that. So Kim, I was wanting to maybe see if you wanted to make a few comments regarding chemical storage on the farm and temperature and all the issues that come with that. So Kim, and I think we're going to need to give the screen to Kim, please.
Hey guys, just while we're waiting, I'll have my presentation ready, I guess. Oh, show my screen. Okay, hang on, I'll just get into presentation mode. Sorry, it just takes a second. While we're waiting, I actually did want to make a plug. I have been asked very late in the year to see if I could find any Canada Fleabane seed. I know it's very late. And we're very lucky in Manitoba. We don't tend to have this weed in our crops very much, certainly not like what we see in other places in Ontario and in the States, where this weed has become glyphosate resistant and it's a real problem. We do tend to see it though on the edges of fields or on the edges of like waste areas or ditches or around yard sites. So if there's anybody out there that has some Canada Fleabane that I might be able to get a bit of seed off of, they're just looking to try to get some seed. They have none from Manitoba. Again, they've asked me just this week, so it's pretty late in the game. So now that my presentation is ready to go, I will just get my pointer going. And there we go. Okay. Okay, so basically storage, it's on the labels. So this is just one of the requirements of pesticide storage, is that there has to be, on the label. Some of them are very descriptive and some of them are pretty vague. It just kind of says store in a cool, dry place. That's pretty much all some of the labels say. But basically, whatever you need to know is on the label. Those labels are, you know, they're on every box you buy, but we do have them in the guide as well. If you're looking in our guide to crop protection, at the end of all of our label pages, I'm just looking at the guide right now, and we have, it's under the restrictions category. And that's where your rainfall, your re-entry interval, and your grazing restrictions, all of those type of things are there, as well as your storage is in there as well. So it is listed on every product page in our guide to crop protection. Whatever's on the label is on our product pages there. So when you're looking to store pesticides, your site selection is really important. You want to make sure you pick a place that is safe from flooding or fire. You want to be a safe distance from water bodies or wells, and you want to be downwind and downhill from sensitive areas. So you've probably already done this. You've got a building already. You've already sited that properly, away from the house, away from the sensitive areas. But the building should be locked, dry, and well ventilated. Should have a concrete or an impermeable floor in case there is a pesticide spill. We would also encourage you to keep your pesticides, if you can, somehow in a container, that if they were spilled, that they wouldn't, you know, get all over the, they wouldn't you know, spill all over the place. Small amounts can be held in something as simple as an old freezer. You take the compressor out, those things are quite light. Once the compressor's gone, and even just something like that where you can store stuff inside, or Rubbermaid containers for 1 or 2 jugs. The good plastic, the pliable ones, not the ones that crack in the cold. Those are a decent investment, and again, they'll store those part jugs, and hopefully if any of those did leak on you, then they would be contained within that jug, or say an old freezer. So anyways, our building, also you should have an inventory of products stored. So what might be easy to, if you took an old binder, just take a used one, it's going to be in the shop, so it's going to get dirty anyways, dirty and dusty. You can get those plastic sleeves that are 3-hole punched, and you can just kind of take your labels off your boxes as you're burning the boxes and you're getting rid of the chemical, or getting rid of the empty jugs. But you can take those labels and you can just pop those in those sleeves and keep that in a binder, and that way you would, you know, if something happened and you needed to know what was there in a hurry, if there's a way of knowing what products are there. This is also a good idea too when you guys are out spraying. Lots of times nobody knows except you what's actually on the sprayer. If there's a water truck in the field, we can see what boxes are there, but you know, God forbid if there was an accident or if something happened and you were out spraying, a lot of times a first responder or another person coming on the scene doesn't really have a clue what's in that sprayer, what could be in that sprayer. And so if there's any way of having that written down or texting to somebody as you go from field to field, I'm in this field, I'm spraying this chemistry, and keep moving. And again, a binder, if you can pull those labels off the boxes and put them in, again, those clear plastic sheets, or they're called page holders, I think, or something. Anyways, they're clear. You can pop a label in, keep it in a binder, and that way you have everything at hand if you need to get at that label in a hurry. So having said that, things that can be frozen, basically most of your granulars or all of your dry products can be frozen, but you just have to keep them cool and dry. You don't want them getting wet anywhere, as you want them in not a high humidity environment. And sometimes it's not listed on the label that it can be frozen, so a bunch of them in our guide weren't listed. I just basically went through all of our product pages in the guide and put them into tables, either can be frozen or can't be frozen, and if there was any disclaimers on that. And so I'll go through that, but some of our granular products aren't on my next couple of slides, and it's just because it wasn't technically on the label, but we know they can be frozen as long as they're not getting wet. So anything that can be frozen, and here I've got a table where I've got the list of the herbicides, and then sometimes they come with instructions and most times they don't. But something like 2,4-D ester and 2,4-DB, that can be frozen. MCPA, the ester form, can be frozen. Avex granular, obviously. Pinoxidin, that's our axial and our axial products. A lot of our products just say store in a cool, dry place. So I haven't listed that for all of them, but most of them, if they can be frozen, they just say store in a cool, dry place. Blackhawk, the label there says if it's frozen, warm it to 10 to 20 degrees and agitate before use. Bromoxynol, now check the brands on this because there is one brand name that says it can't be frozen, but if it's frozen, warm to room temperature, agitate before use. As we go down the list here, bromoxynol 2,4-D, bromoxynol MCPA, basically this one, all it said is shake well when thawed. If we keep going through, clethodim, that's our Centurion, our Select products, our Cladinifop, our Old Horizon, and those generic products. Dicamba, all of those, dichloroprop plus 2,4-D, those can all be frozen, didn't have any disclaimers on there. Edge, obviously the granular can be frozen, but it says do not expose to prolonged sunlight or heat. And we know that Edge, the group 3, the dinitroaniline products in general, do break down in sunlight. So even when they're being stored, make sure they're not exposed to sunlight or heat. Eptam, liquid EC can be stored, can be frozen, Fierce can be frozen. Now Flexstar, and this is our first one, but there's a few on the list. The next page, it has a few as well. It can be frozen, but it has to be stored above -10. So it still needs some type of heated storage. It doesn't have to be at 0, but it can't get below -10. So you may as well have that one in heated storage anyways. And I should make a disclaimer, I'd rather see all products stored in heated storage just so that we don't have to worry about anything coming out of solution. Lots of times if they settle out or if they crystallize, once they're warmed up and they're shaken a bit, invert the jugs back and forth, roll them around and shake them really well before they're used and before they go into the sprayer. Most times they're fine, but it would be better if we just never had to do that in the first place. But if they do get frozen, again, some of them have special instructions, but again, something like Flexstar, you can freeze it, but only to -10. Here's Stellar, basically, if frozen, warm to room temperature and agitate before use. I've got another page of things that can be frozen, and then we'll go into the stuff that really can't be, and certain temperature things. There's Inferno Duo. Our glyphosate can be frozen. If it does, come out of solution or it does get, I guess, thick, you want to warm it up slowly, warm it up to room temperature. Again, this isn't really on the label, but that's just, again, how most of these will work. But some of them do have very specific temperatures that are on the label. But glyphosate in general can be frozen, but it would be, again, better if we didn't freeze any of them. Hot Shot says store above -10 again, so it's got very limited freezing ability. Hurricane, store between 4 and 37 degrees. Infinity, store above -20. So again, with our winters, you still need some type of heated storage for these. As we go through Metolachlor, that's our dual, our metribuzin, our metsulfuron, that's Sencor, is metribuzin, and then metsulfuron is ally. Those can be frozen. Pulsar, if it's frozen, warm it to room temperature, agitate before use. Quinclorac, same thing. Rimsulfuron, again, some of these are dry, but it does actually say on the label that you can store them, you can freeze them. Roundup Extend, store above -10, if frozen, warm to up to 20 degrees. Again, that's that room temperature, and agitate before use. And Simplicity, store above -9 degrees and warm to 7 degrees and agitate before use. So that's coming right off the label. And the rest here, the granulars obviously can be frozen, and then Volterra as well, which has a liquid formulation as well. The things that do not freeze, and lots of times it's in kind of shouty capitals like that, in do not freeze. The amine forms of 2,4-D, MCPA, the sodium MCPA, and as well MCPA/MCPB. Tropotox, you can't freeze those ones. So the esters you can, the amines you can't. Atrex can't be frozen, atrazine. Keto, again, here it says store above 5 degrees. So if frozen, bring to room temperature, agitate before use. Aries, just says store in a cool, dry place. And I actually don't have the BASF products in here. I do have a separate sheet for BASF because they have that. So I'll actually go into that in a minute. This is actually an old BASF product. It's Corteva now. Authority is store above 5 degrees. If frozen, warm to above 15 degrees and agitate. Authority Supreme, same thing. If we go into Avidex, Avenza, Axial Extreme, and Broadband, no special, nothing special, just basically don't freeze them. Brotex 480, for some reason, this one is different than the other bromoxynils. It says store above 7 degrees. Bromoxynil, MCPA, and Fluorox, if frozen, allow to warm and shake well. Carfentrazone, all they have on their label is avoid excess heat. Clopyralid, if it's frozen, bring to room temperature and agitate before use. Make sure, but whatever you've got, just make sure it's coming back into solution before we use these. Clopyralid and MCPA, basically your curtail M there, you store above, it needs to be stored above 5 degrees. And again, if it does get frozen, warm it to room temp and then agitate, and the same as our clopyralid when we add Fluorox into there. Going on to Command, store above 5 degrees, warm to room temperature. Conquer, store above 3 degrees. If we go through this dicamba, Microprop, and MCPA, that's Target. Diquat, same thing, don't freeze those. Distinct, stored above 5 degrees. Enforcer, if it's frozen, allow it to warm and shake well. Exhilarate, phenoxyprop, don't freeze those. Fluorastulam, if frozen, bring it to room temperature, agitate before use. Flucarbazone, that's our Everest. And our Sierra, same thing, don't freeze it. Here's Inferno Trio. There's basically fluoroxapyr. So a lot of products with fluoroxapyr in them can't be frozen. So you've seen that in some of these other products in here. If frozen, bring to room temperature and agitate. Focus is store above 5 degrees, warm it to above 15, or basically get it to room temperature and agitate before use. Glufosinate, don't freeze it. Goldwing, Corex, Manipulator, again, not a herbicide, but a growth regulator, don't freeze it. Microprop, Momentum, store above 5 degrees and agitate before use. And I think I have one more page of this, and basically Octane, same thing, if frozen, bring to room temperature, agitate before use. The rest of these on here, Optica Trio, Paradigm Pre, Pixero, Prospect, Assure, Quizalofop are basically the Assures, Reflex, Rexaid, basically just, they don't have any special instructions, just don't freeze them. Signal FSU, if frozen, warm to 10 degrees and agitate before use. Simazine, you have to check the brands though, because some, I think one of them can be frozen, but I just thought to be on the safe side, check the brand names on that. And again, when we get into the dry, some of them, there's some products when there's a dry part and a liquid part and it's a co-pack, obviously the dry part could be frozen, but the liquid part can't be frozen. And if it's frozen, you need to bring it to room temperature and agitate. This is our Armazon or Impact, stored above 5 degrees, please. And then if frozen, warm it up and agitate. Travalis says if frozen, warm it to 10. Traxos, Tridem, Treflan liquid, store above 5 degrees, warm it to above 15. And the other ones here, Tundra, Ultra Blazer, Vero, and Velocity basically just said do not freeze. So they don't have any special instructions past that. So what I did get from our friends at BASF was a really nice product guide here, just a one-pager. And this has the herbicides, but over here, but as well it has the fungicides, their inoculants, their seed treatments, their insecticides, and their adjuvants as well. So basically, if you have anything in this column from BASF that does require heated storage, that's your Altitude, your Armazon, your Bazagran Forte, Certitude, Heat Complete, Heat, Liberty, Odyssey, Odyssey Ultra, Post Ultra, Pursuit, Smolder, that's a new one from them, Solo, Solo ADV, Solo Ultra, Viper, Veraxor, again, one of their newer ones, and Zidua. Those all, plus at merge, if you've got merge on the place, you would need to keep that, in heated storage as well. And the ones that do not require heated storage, again, it's usually a much smaller list. Centurion, that's Clefidem, Distinct, Ingenia, those are dicamba, the Ingenia is a dicamba product, Facet, and then Frontier Max. And again, they've got their insecticides here as well, and their adjuvant. If you have the assist adjuvant, then it does not require heated storage. So that's all I had on that. If you have any specific questions, again, we could go right to that label to get that information.
Okay, thanks, Kim. That was a good answer for what we can and how to store some of the chemicals for the winter. While we're getting Talise to give the screen back to me, I'm going to ask Dennis Lang to maybe comment on inoculants. I see BASF has their list there. Dennis, any comments about inoculants and how to store them?
Well, I guess the first thing you really have to look at what the expiry date is, because a lot of the inoculants do have an expiry date. So if you're trying to keep something that was for this past year that you used, and the expiry date is, let's say, July of 2021, then that's pretty much not something I'd want to use for the following year. If you are purchasing some and bringing it home early, you got to divide it up into two groups. If you look at liquid cannot be frozen. You want to store it below 20 degrees, and 0 to 20, but definitely not frozen. Always check the expiry dates. For peat-based and inoculants, they can be frozen, but you want to keep them frozen until you're ready to use them. You don't want to thaw them out. As far as granular inoculants go, they can be frozen as well. But again, the same thing applies, that you don't want to thaw it out until you're ready to use it, or just shortly before. One of the companies had made a comment that if you're buying larger quantities of granular, they have a 2-pallet stacking height, so they don't want to stack like 3 or 4 high. So those are some of the big things. And then if you're buying treated seed that's already been pre-inoculated and you're bringing it home, again, keep it in a cool place, so under 20 degrees, and you should be fine. But those are kind of some of the quick, dirty tips for that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dennis. There is a BMP for if anybody's looking at a storage unit for chemical through the Environmental Farm Plan program. So if you have questions regarding that, you can contact myself or Kim, and we can give you more information on that. Next question to John Gavlowski. How far do I need to go with my seed treatments for next year? Seeing lots of flea beetles in the fall, does this mean a large population in the spring? Do I have to go full bore on the insecticides, or do I have more options for the spring, or new options for the spring? Got you muted, John. Can you unmute yourself?
Says he's also muted by his organizer.
Talise, could you? Okay, well, we're looking through that one. John, I just heard you on the line there. There was, you had a slide you wanted to show regarding fall broadcasting. Talise, can we hand the screen over to John?
Okay, I just wanted to show, because I guess I've been slagging broadcasting fall nitrogen here. And just thought I better just show my justification for this. Of course, there's lots of old data showing that it's rather inefficient, but Indian Head Ag Research Foundation's been doing some of this testing. So I've just summarized their last couple years of research. And I'll put it here in a slide, color coding, basically showing they only had 1 year of test with canola comparing fall versus spring, their gold standard being spring banded urea. So I've indexed the yields here and note that fall broadcast applications, even with inhibitors, we're looking at high 80s as far as percent yield compared to spring, or fall banded applications perform fairly well also. And with wheat, more studies, again, fall broadcast, even with some of the inhibitors and things not performing as well, and much lower protein than a spring applied. If we look at the fall applied, that's banded in the blue here below, we see that it's nearing the same performance that we're getting with spring banded urea. So fall banded can perform well, and not only with yield, but with the protein. So that's still the way to go, according to research, is that banding still far outperforms any broadcasting, even if we coat the broadcasting products with some of the inhibitors. That's all I wanted to say. I'll try to write something up on this, Lionel.
Okay, that's good information, John, because we're seeing more and more broadcasting over the last couple of years too. So that's good information to see.
Oh, this won't slow them down a sec. They're enamored with the practice.
Okay, good. So Talise, if you can give the screen back to me, and I think, John, are you on right now?
I am, yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. You could maybe take a look at the flea beetle question and maybe give information. Some guys are buying their canola seed already and just wondering about how far they need to go with their seed treatments, and maybe your comments on flea beetles and what maybe we can expect for next year.
Sure, and it's a very tricky question because there has been attempts of research to try to correlate late summer and spring populations, and generally things don't always correlate well, so it's very tricky to predict. I know there are companies that will produce maps that try to suggest what levels would be like in the spring, but again, the peer-reviewed research that's been attempted on that shows the correlation is very bad. In fact, I did see one of those maps recently, and it was showing some red spots for Manitoba, meaning high levels, but it showed a lot of white spots, meaning not much was reported, I guess. But I do know that some of those areas, there were a lot of flea beetles in the fall, so I don't have a lot of faith in maps trying to predict what's going to happen in the spring. But given what happened last August and September, levels were very high. I would say be cautious going into spring. Definitely, the canola seeds all going to be protected anyway. I won't pick favorites with products. I would say if you have had some chronic cutworm issues and you're anticipating that might continue, then something like a Lumiderm or Fertenza Advance might be a worthwhile add-in. And you'll pay more for it, so again, you'd want to use that in areas that might be a bit higher risk. Although cutworm populations have been going down, this year wasn't as bad as the previous couple years, but there still were some areas where people were having a lot of cutworm issues. So again, it's a very tricky question. It's really hard to predict what will happen next year. So yeah, just be cautious, and really what's going to determine whether, whatever seed treatment you choose, what's going to determine whether it provides enough control on its own or not. It's unfortunately the weather. The secret is getting the canola from the day you seed until the 3 to 4 leaf stage within about 3 weeks, ideally. which doesn't often happen because of weather conditions. I had some reports this year that canola seeded, and it took almost 3 weeks for them to see anything poking above the ground. And that's all time ticking, because again, the seed treatments start wearing out when you seed, not when the plants come up. So unfortunately, dry, cool springs will be one of your enemies in battling flea beetles.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Oops. Dane, lots of fertilizer going on this fall. What is a good recommended blend of fertilizer to put down with canola seed in the spring?
It is going to really depend on what a grower soil test has coming back this year. There are widely varying numbers. Really depends on yield, really depends on stubble, depends on soil texture and position in the landscape. There's no one quick and easy answer. Fertilizer is extremely expensive right now. It's typically more expensive in spring, but we don't know that for sure. I don't have a crystal ball to look into. If you're going to be putting down canola seed or fert with the seed in spring, do your due diligence and check your soil moisture ahead of time. Canola can handle up to 20-25 pounds of seed-placed P, according to our soil fertility guide. Many farms do push that number higher, and we have seen fairly significant seed-placed fertilizer injury in the past couple of years. As we have really dry soils, I'm not sure what spring will bring. We've had some rain now, but no guarantees that it will be wet again come spring. So perhaps lowering that rate to a lower seed placed safe rate and making sure the nitrogen and sulfur is outside that seed band might be the plan. I don't have an exact number for a grower. That is really going to depend on their soil tests and a conversation they have with a qualified agronomist.
Okay, good point. I think seeing what the spring is going to bring, I think, is going to be a big decision there as to what. And I think a lot of guys are putting a lot on this fall too, so they might even.
I'd like to add too that a split application might be a good way to hedge your bets. If you're going across the field with an anhydrous tank and a granular air cart anyway, perhaps putting something down in the fall band might be an advantageous way to save some cost if we're looking at a higher spring cost or potentially issues with supply. That might be advantageous. Or if we're faced with another dry spring, just settle down and hold on and wait, and there's always the opportunity to top dress. We can go in and top dress with liquid. I guess prior to the peak demand, I mean, canola and many other crops do require a little bit of seed placed P in particular to get a bit of a pop-up effect, but you don't need much more than 10 pounds to do that. So there's always a chance to come back a little later prior to that high demand, that tillering, that bolting stage for many crops and address the deficiencies there.
Okay, a question just came in. Canola seed row blend, any thoughts on using low salt phosphate like top phos and then being able to add a bit of potash to the top phos and being seed safe?
Potash has a high salt effect, and canola does use potash, but not to the same extent as some other crops might, like soybeans. I don't have a lot of faith in fertilizer claims that have a lower salt index or salt effect than others. If it is lower, it's generally marginal, and it tends to be some pretty slick marketing. So really delve into what the salt effect index is between the product that you're looking to replace a regular MAP 1152 with, and seeing if there truly is a difference. And then to try and top up with some potash, unless you're on a sandier soil or something like that. Potash needs in canola are quite minimal for uptake, and then it doesn't remove a lot from the field either. Most of that goes back into the ground. If you have a sandy soil that does need a lot of potash, you'd be looking at volumes that you wouldn't be able to replace an adequate rate by banding it or putting it in with a seed row anyway. You might be more effective actually broadcasting potash in that instance, but at fairly high rates. So we're looking 60, 80, 100 pounds actual K per acre in those situations. So I'm skeptical
Me too, Dane. I think you've nailed it. I think the salt index is overrated for seed place safety. It's largely the ammonium content. And darn it all, I want some salt effect. Salt means your fertilizer dissolves, and fertilizer needs to dissolve in order to be effective. So you got to live with some salt effect anyways. It's the ammonium portion to worry about.
Yeah, good point.
Hey.
Thanks, John.
Good points, guys. Thanks for that. Okay, just a few slides to finish off for today. Wanted to remind everybody again about the Livestock Feed Transportation Drought Assistance Program, the Livestock Transportation Drought Assistance Program, and so basically the programs are there. I'll show you the 1844 number if you have questions regarding the program or want to fill in applications or get your applications in. The Manitoba hay listing, there's hay for sale, or if you're looking for hay, you can put your information on there. Crop residue burning, that's still going. So if you're wanting to burn, you should check and see if you need a permit. The ag adaptation specialists in the province, there's our contact information. And again, if you're looking for help with the programs that are available, give us a call, as well as a livestock extension specialist. There's all their contact information. They've been working, frontline with the program. So if you have questions, definitely give these people a call as well. Your MASC offices, again, they have information regarding the program, as well as time to start getting in your seeded acreage reports in, and all that kind of information is needed. So definitely get working on that. And we're going to take a week off next week. We're going to come back for the November 3rd, and then we're probably looking at having 2 a month, so 2 in November and 2 in December, and just to kind of keep it rolling as we finish off the year. So I'd like to thank the panelists today. A lot of really good information given out, a lot of diverse questions. So I think it was a lot of good information brought to you today. And so again, I'd like to thank the panelists, and thank you for attending and your questions. So see you on November the 3rd.